It had been a long Christmas Eve, and Geoffrey Milton was sore, tired, and in desperate need of a stiff drink. It really did not bother him in the slightest that he looked like an idiot, sitting as he was at the back of Thompson's toy store, dressed in a bright red Santa outfit. A huge fake beard clung to his face, held in place by an elastic band that dug painfully into the back of his head. His grotto was a mix of plywood and cardboard, painted in the usually joyous colors of the festive season, and covered with fake snow that clung to his outfit whenever he leaned against the wretched stuff. He checked his watch and frowned. It was coming up to 3 in the afternoon, which meant he still had at least an hour before he could leave. He had lost count of the number of smelly, snot-nosed children he'd spoken to so far, each one having perched upon his knee while he asked the same monotonous question: "What do you want for Christmas?" And each time he prayed that once they were removed there would not be some undesirable stain left behind on his lap. Geoffrey hated children. He had for as long as he could remember. He supposed that he must have felt differently when he was a child himself. But now, a tired and somewhat cantankerous man of 62, he was truly thankful he'd never made that horrible mistake and had children of his own, even though that decision had cost him the only woman he would ever love. His mind wandered, as it so often would, to thoughts of his Sally. He had met her when he was in his early 20s, working as a chef at the harbour side at what used to be a little French restaurant, unimaginatively named Le Restaurant Français. Sally Shepherd was one of the waitresses there, and he'd fallen in love with her the moment they'd first met. They had started dating, and it wasn't long before they'd moved in together. They'd enjoyed 6 amazing years, and eventually he had proposed. As he knelt before her, a modest, yet undeniably beautiful diamond ring held aloft, he watched the sadness fall across her face as she told him that she could never marry him. She wanted desperately to be a mother, and she knew that he could never be the man to make that dream a reality. And so that was that. They'd decided there was no future for them, and they had gone their separate ways. Eventually, she'd moved out of the area, and he'd long ago stopped hoping that she would someday come waltzing back into his life. He had never allowed himself to love again. The crack left in his heart had made him too bitter, and to this day it had never healed. Deep down, he knew that it never would. Geoffrey sighed audibly to himself and peered through the small window of his grotto and out across the store. It had not been busy for hours, and it had been at least 30 minutes since anyone had stepped through the doors. The shop's owner, Sidney Thompson, a tall stick of a man with a stubby nose and bushy eyebrows, was currently busying himself, making sure the toys on the shelves were all priced and positioned correctly. "Sid," he called over, "what do you say we pack it in for the day?" Sidney looked over his shoulder towards the grotto. "I told you, 4 o'clock, Jeff," he replied, before returning to his pointless busy work. Geoffrey sat back in his chair with a loud groan, before almost jumping out of his skin. Standing in the doorway to the grotto was a small child. He was certainly no expert in these things, but by his guess, he must have been 6 or 7 years old. "Christ," he said, taking a deep breath. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." The child, a small boy with brown hair, wearing a pair of black trousers and a red jumper, just looked at him with wide blue eyes. Several moments passed as they simply stared at each other. Eventually, Geoffrey leaned forwards in his chair. "Where's your mum, lad?" he asked, peering past the boy to see if he could see his parents. He could have sworn that nobody had come into the store, but he shrugged, guessing that he'd simply just not noticed. "Are you really Father Christmas?" asked the unblinking boy in a near whisper. Geoffrey shook himself slightly and smiled a well-practiced, warm smile from behind the huge beard. "Why, yes," he said in a suddenly jolly voice. "Of course I am." The boy just continued to stare at him. In a vain attempt to break the awkward silence, Geoffrey added, "Ho, ho, ho." But still, the uncomfortable silence hung between them. Eventually, Geoffrey could bear it no longer. "Did you want to sit on my lap then?" he asked. "Why?" the child asked plainly. He continued to stare blankly up at Geoffrey. Those large blue eyes seemed dull and vacant. He hadn't noticed that before. The boy was also deathly pale, with a greenish tint to his skin. "Don't you want to tell me what you want for Christmas?" Geoffrey was beginning to feel uneasy. He looked back out to the store through his little window. "You should really be with your parents, you know," he said. His eyes scanned the shop floor, still not seeing any sign of the adults that the boy might belong to. "They're gone." The child's voice seemed distant somehow. "The fire took them." "You what?" Geoffrey said in alarm as he turned back to the boy again. But he was gone. He hauled himself out of his seat and ducked under the doorway, his head looking from side to side. "Where'd he go?" he said, more to himself than anyone else. "You what?" said Sid, from behind a rack of hanging toys. Geoffrey ignored him as he marched around the store, checking every nook. "That's it," he exclaimed after finding no sign of the child. "I don't care what you say, Sid. I'm done." Sidney looked at his watch and opened his mouth to protest. "I don't care," Geoff said, cutting him off. "I'm going to the pub, and then I'm going home." Sidney strode over to the till in a huff. "I should dock you that last hour," he grumbled as he went. "You better bloody not," Geoff snapped back, becoming more irritable by the moment. Sidney took several notes out of the till, before placing them one at a time in Geoffrey's hand. 6 £10 notes. Not much, he thought to himself, but better than a kick in the arse. "I'm getting someone else to do this next year." Sid was clearly disgruntled as he turned his back on the other man as he spoke. "You say that every year, you miserable old sod," Geoffrey replied as he made his way to the door. "I'll pop the suit back to you on Boxing Day," he added as he opened the door and stepped out onto the high street. The cold air hit his cheeks like 1,000 tiny needles as he watched his breath as it rose up through the lamplight and then into the dark skies above. It had started to snow. The large cumbersome flakes drifted slowly to the street, where they had already begun to settle. Sticking his hands under his arms, he began trudging off up the street to the Harbourman pub, where he knew there'd be a pint of bitter, and maybe even a couple of double whiskies with his name on them. By the time Geoffrey had said his goodbyes to the many familiar faces he knew in the pub, the snow outside was a good couple of inches deep, and it crunched satisfyingly as he stepped out onto the street. Standing under the lamplight of the swaying sign that hung above the pub door, he took a deep breath. The cold air filled his lungs, causing a slight dull ache in his chest that he knew would stay with him long into the night. It always seemed to happen when the cold set in these days. He had kept telling himself, make an appointment, speak to a doctor. But his fears about what they might say always changed his mind. So for now, he would just keep plodding along, until he no longer could. The town around him looked like something out of a Christmas card. Snow coated the old-fashioned Victorian lanterns that lined the streets, and the bright white twinkling Christmas lights that decorated the area caused the still falling flakes to glisten and shine. He started to trudge off up the road, pulling his hat down tight onto his head. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled free the false beard and reattached it to his face. Christ alive, it's bloody cold, he said aloud as he hurried on his way. By the time Geoffrey had reached his front door, it was almost 11 o'clock, and his feet were beginning to ache as the cold seeped through his boots and socks. Hurriedly, he slotted his door key into the lock, turning it and shuffling into his house, remembering to kick the worst of the snow from his boots before he did so. The terraced house was a small one-bedroom affair, the front door opening directly into the tiny, yet cozy living room. In front of the large bay window beside the door sat a modest television set, directly opposite his two-seater sofa. Geoffrey pulled the oversized Santa hat from his head, and along with his fake beard, tossed them nonchalantly onto the arm of the chair. On the adjoining wall was the fireplace. Getting down onto his knees, Geoffrey began screwing up pages from old newspapers and arranging them neatly within the hearth. A nice fire, a cup of tea, and we'll see if there's anything on the telly, he said to himself as he struck a match and held it to the paper. Living alone as he did, he often spoke to himself these days. As the kindling began to catch, he took a couple of small logs and placed them into the fire. With considerable effort, he pushed himself up to his feet, cursing at the cracking sounds that emanated from his knees. With a sigh, he made his way past the stairs through to the small kitchen at the back of the house. Nothing like a nice cup of tea to warm the cockles, he thought to himself as he filled the kettle from the tap. Taking a mug from one of the overhead cupboards, he placed a tea bag into it. He added 2 large teaspoons of sugar and patiently waited for the kettle to boil. The unexpected knock at his door roused him from the dazed state he hadn't even noticed he'd fallen into. He blinked several times, thinking he must have imagined the sound. The kettle finally clicked off as the water within boiled. He lifted it and poured it into his mug when he heard it again, louder this time. "Oh, fuck," he went to blurt out, catching himself before the unsavory word could leave his lips. He placed the kettle back down on the kitchen counter and made his way back through to the living room. He opened the front door, just partially, and peered out into the dimly lit street beyond. There, standing on the doorstep, still dressed only in his black trousers and red sweater, was the little boy from the toy shop. Their eyes met, the child glaring accusingly at him. "What are you doing here?" Geoffrey said simply, unsure of what he was supposed to do in this situation. The child must have been freezing out here in the snow, dressed as he was, in just a single layer of clothing. "Your beard's gone," the boy spoke quietly, but with firm purpose. Geoffrey's brow creased with confusion. "My beard?" He looked back to the fluffy, uncomfortable accessory that still sat discarded on the arm of his sofa. He turned back to the boy once more. There was nobody there. Geoffrey leaned out of the front door, looking left and right up and down the street. Nothing. He looked down at the spot where the young lad had been standing. The snow was unbroken, all but for the footprints that he himself had left there just a handful of minutes ago. With a final shake of his head, he stepped back and closed the door, once again shutting out the cold and still tumbling snow. "Well, that's it, Jeff," he said to himself. "You've finally gone mad." Turning away, he headed back through to the kitchen and his waiting cup of tea. The fire had turned to mere embers when Geoffrey awoke with a start. He was sitting upon his sofa, his almost empty mug still held loosely in his hand, and a packet of half-emptied biscuits on his lap. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The television in front of him was playing an advert for some kind of floor cleaner, with an accompanying jingle that was already grating on him. His free hands fumbled to his side until his fingers grasped around the TV remote. With the push of a button, the television went dark. He yawned and rubbed at his tired eyes before squinting down at his watch. It was 23 minutes past 3 in the morning. "Merry Christmas, Jeff," he grumbled to himself. With the greatest of effort, he hauled himself up to his feet, and with labored steps he staggered into the kitchen, placing his mug within the sink. It was definitely time to go to bed, he thought to himself. He had no real plans to go anywhere that day. Neither was he planning on seeing anyone. Who would he see? He had no family left alive, and only a few people that he would call friends. No, he would head up to bed, sleep until mid-morning, and then sit in front of the telly and drink the bottle of single malt whiskey he'd saved for this day. His knees raised against him in protest as he slowly climbed the stairs. Once at the summit, he turned to his right, easing open the door to the bedroom. Shuffling his way out of the ridiculous outfit he was still wearing, he peeled off the rest of his clothes that lay underneath. Finally, wearing just his plain white vest and briefs, he climbed into bed, pulled the covers over himself, and closed his eyes. Before long, he had drifted off into a deep sleep. His eyes snapped open as something icy cold brushed against his foot. One of his legs had broken free of the duvet to hang precariously over the side of the bed. He pulled the limb back under the covers as he shifted back from the edge and into the middle of his double bed. He reached down under the covers, rubbing at the spot in his foot that now stung from the sudden shock of the cold. An arctic chill fell across his cheeks, his breath misting as it escaped his mouth. He shivered, pulling the covers up around his shoulder. "You lied to me." The voice cut through the silence of the dark room, the severe tone hard but emotional, and unmistakingly that of a child. "Who's there?" Geoffrey demanded. He'd managed to sound more authoritative than he was feeling, as he curled up, cold and almost naked beneath the covers. A small, dark, smouldering hand reached up from beside the bed, its fingers digging into the sheets, leaving a crimson smear as its twin appeared alongside it. With a sound like air slowly being released from a valve, a blistered, bleeding and charred head arose, part of the skull showing where the skin had burnt away. Geoffrey gasped aloud as he scrambled further back from the edge of the bed. The child's face was haunting to behold. He had no eyes, just deep black chasm-like sockets, surrounded by a web of cracked skin that wept and oozed. It opened its mouth to reveal decaying grey teeth and an inky black tongue. "What do you want?" The authority was gone from Geoffrey's voice now, the words a mere whimper as panic gripped him. Slowly, and deliberately, the child heaved itself onto the bed, not once looking away from the man that cowered before it. With a stifled scream, Geoffrey lurched backwards, toppling off the bed and landing into a crumpled heap upon the thin carpet. Wide-eyed and desperate, he scrambled to his feet. The bed was empty. He took in the rest of the room, but the child was nowhere to be seen. Slowly, he backed up against the window, trying in vain to control his breathing as it came in short, sharp bursts. His head began to throb, and he reached up to the base of his skull, wincing as he did so. His fingers came away damp, and he cursed to himself. He was lucky he hadn't broken his neck. Once more certain that he was alone, he skirted around the bed and hurried through into the bathroom. Turning on the light, he raised a hand to block the sudden brightness as he reached for the sink and turned on the tap. He cupped the flowing water in both hands and splashed it across his face. This was a nightmare. Surely he was still asleep. Surely this was just a really messed up dream. He turned to leave the bathroom but stopped. There in the doorway stood the child once again. Geoffrey raised a hand in front of him. "Why are you doing this to me?" he pleaded. "What do you want?" "I want my mummy and daddy," came the small reply. "I want them back for Christmas." The boy took a step forward. "But you're not Father Christmas." He almost snarled the last word. "You can't give me what I want." The boy took another step. He raised his hands up as if reaching out to be comforted. In one hand, he held aloft a solitary match. Without warning, the head sparked, and the match ignited. For a brief moment, the flame danced gently on the end of the matchstick, before suddenly roaring violently as it spread across the little boy's hand and up the sleeve of his jumper. "I want my mummy and daddy," he screamed, as he was engulfed from head to toe in the now raging inferno. The heat beat against Geoffrey's skin with an intensity he'd never experienced before. Slowly, the screaming child drew closer. A small hand gripped his forearm, and he bellowed out in pain. He could feel his skin blister and split apart as the boy drew himself in, wrapping a thin arm around Geoffrey's waist and burying his head into his chest. Geoffrey raised his eyes to the ceiling and cried out as the fire consumed him. His flesh bubbled and peeled away as he stood trapped and powerless in the boy's deadly embrace. For many, Christmas morning had begun with the flashing blue light of emergency vehicles that now blocked the street. Smoke still belched from the broken windows as the sun began to rise over the surrounding houses. But finally, the fire was extinguished. A young police sergeant stood patiently on the pavement. As a firefighter emerged from the house, he stepped forward. "So how's it looking, Bob?" the sergeant asked. The fireman was older than him by a good 20 years, a short, grizzled-looking man with deep creases across his weather-beaten face. He returned the sergeant's gaze with grey eyes. "Well," he began, rubbing at the back of his neck, "there'll need to be a proper investigation, but to me it looks like a log rolled out of the fireplace. The carpet caught alight and whoosh." He paused for a moment, looking back into the house. "Shit," was all the sergeant could say, as he followed the firefighter's gaze up at the blackened brickwork around the windows. "More common than you'd think," Bob chewed thoughtfully. "It's not the first time I've seen it." He turned to move away. "And I doubt it'll be the last."